And I think the problem is that even over the time that I've been using Linux, there's been, and I'm sure it's been even more so over the entire lifespan, there's been a shift in the kind of people using Linux. It's become less technical people, it's become less programmers, it's more general, normal people. And
Right.
they're going to have a different expectation with the way like software is handled. Like if you go back to the start of Linux, for example, back then, like the very, very start, like pre-Debian, if you wanted to install Linux at that point, you needed to have a Minix system or another Unix system that you use to bootstrap your file system that you could then put the Linux kernel onto, and then you would need to use that Minix system to go and compile your tools and bring the tools over as well. Like at that point, you have to be a very technical user. You probably have
Right.
minimum some level of programming background. So basically everybody back then was contributing to projects in some way, whether it was to the Linux kernel, whether it was to some tool. Like I'm sure there was someone out there that was using it that
I would.
wasn't.
I'll say, I don't know if this is a popular opinion, but it's just what I've noticed.
Mhm.
It's not like I've done an analysis on this or anything, but it seems to me like it was Windows Vista's fault, believe it or not. I know that sounds
Okay.
strange, but okay. So when Windows Vista came out, and I don't need to go into Windows Vista. I
What
think everybody
year was
knows that
Vista?
debacle. Was that like 2006 or so? I want to say, I could
Sounds
be
close to
guessing.
right.
But
7.
either way, it came out, it made a lot of people angry because it was, just didn't perform well. People had complaints. Now, when I first started using Linux, it was like installing the NVIDIA driver. You were risking bricking your entire install and having to start completely over from scratch each and every single time you do that. So around 2006 or 2007, I can't remember exactly, but somewhere around there, Ubuntu started the Ubuntu drivers thing to automatically install the NVIDIA driver if you needed that kind of thing. And then around the same time, I think the Totem video player had the feature where if you try to play a media player, or excuse me, a file type that you don't have a codec for, it'll tell you that it can't play it, but then proceed to apt install whatever it needs and then play the video. I
Oh,
feel
GNOME
like
videos
all of those
demos. Okay.
changes, especially like live CDs where you could demo before you install it and have that entire environment, I feel like all of that, at least as far as I remember, happened around the Windows Vista time period, which makes me think that the boost of Linux to what we have today started from anger from Windows Vista that
Hmm.
we kind of don't even remember now, because that to me was the time period where it really started to get easier because I started noticing I had to do less.
Right.
I had to do less to get my Wi-Fi driver installed. I had to do less to get my video driver installed. I could use a live image. Like Knoppix came out is a huge, huge revolutionary thing to put a DVD in your drive and just run from the DVD. We don't even think of it as anything but, something we take for granted now. But
Mhm.
back then, it's almost like we had this Linux renaissance because of Windows Vista that no one really noticed happened.
Mhm. I would say the first, it's definitely a smaller turning point, but the first turning point would have been the shipping of Ubuntu because
Yeah.
that changed the distro landscape. Because pre-Ubuntu, how long have you been using Linux for? When did you
I
start?
started in about 2002.
Okay, okay, cool.
So,
So you're around there. Cool.
yep,
I can skip over some of the
yep,
context. Um, so for anyone who doesn't know, prior to Ubuntu, it was very common for there to be paid Linux distros, not just like, oh, you paid Red Hat to use their like their commercial support and all that. It was no,
was
it
Caldera one of them? I can't remember now.
yeah.
Something like that.
But
There was a few.
there was a lot of these paid distros. You would buy a Linux DVD, and not just buy a Linux DVD because that was a convenient way to get it. Like that was the only way to get it. You bought a
Right,
DVD to get it. Ubuntu came along and killed that. You don't see
right,
paid distros as a norm nowadays. There are obviously examples. You have Elementary has their optional it's basically a donation on the download page. You have Red Hat, which doesn't sell you the distro, they sell you support. And that's the way that it's typically done now. Usually there isn't an upfront distro cost, it's a cost for the things that come along with it. Because Ubuntu completely destroyed that model by doing everything they did completely for free because
Yep.
it was funded by someone who was a multimillionaire and could afford to do that initially and destroyed that model entirely. So that was the first
Yeah.
start. And then obviously, yeah, Vista I think is a big one as well. I
Yep.
think the next big shift was probably when Linux gaming became viable. There might have been something else in between there as well, but that was definitely a massive thing. Because
I
then,
don't know. I might not agree on the gaming part of it. I
okay,
mean, I feel like it's going to be bigger. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying gaming isn't better. It's awesome. But as far as having an impact on Linux, I feel like maybe many of those people were already interested in Linux anyway, because I think of things a little bit differently.
mhm,
Because when I look at the overall ecosystem, like when I was a kid, I had a Sega Genesis. I knew that a Super Nintendo cartridge would not fit in my Sega Genesis,
mhm,
and I couldn't play it on that system. So why are people nowadays thinking that Linux needs to play their Windows software when it was never made for Linux in the first place? When my understanding has always been this OS, this platform takes that software, this OS, that platform takes that software. When I hear about people gaming on Linux, I often think of it as like trying to make it out to be something that it isn't. It's like they
mhm,
want to take this piece of Windows with them over to Linux. And sure, Linux will probably do it better. And I feel like Linux is better overall for this, but the developers see it differently and they have to port these games over. It just seems to me like going straight to the source and playing games on Windows would be the better way to go. But instead, we're forcing games to go on Linux and then and that's all okay. But where I have a problem with it is when people say, I hate Linux because it doesn't run my games. Well, it was never supposed to run your games. It was
mhm.
never advertised to run your Windows games. So I feel like the thing that is amazing about gaming on Linux is just how they solve this problem. Like, we want this to work, so here's what we're going to do.
Mhm.
And then Steam comes along and says, we want this to work. And there's these people that come together and want this to happen, even though the software isn't meant for it. The end result is we get together, we make it happen anyway. But I don't know that I guess my point is, as amazing as the, outcome is, I don't know that I would say gaming is quite a big boost in Linux, when it comes to usability, but then again, I'm not an analyst, so there could be, a
I
flaw in that.
I can't speak for everybody, but I can say for a fact that I probably wouldn't be daily driving Linux if I couldn't play games on it. Like I
Hmm,
want to play games on my system. Like that for me is a massive use case, and that was one of the things that kept me away from it back like when I first like one of the things that one of the big things I first heard about with Linux was when the Steam machines came along, and the Steam
oh,
machines
yeah,
being an utter failure basically because
right.
they tried to force developers to make games for a platform that didn't have gamers on it, which was just not a it was not a sensible like marketing
No.
strategy for it. So
I
being
was
able to
hoping that would work, but it didn't. Yeah,
yeah,
I do remember that.
so being able to say to developers, hey, with some maybe minor tweaks, but in most cases you don't need to do anything. Your games are here. It for the users who actually are interested in gaming, it's less of a difficult transition because most people don't want to dual boot. I know some people like dual booting and that's neat. I don't want to dual boot. When I dual boot, I don't dual boot
Yeah.
properly. Like my dual boot is the laziest. I swap my drives in my BIOS because I've had nothing but issues trying to set it up properly with my bootloader.